I shouldn't have said it out loud. That was the first thought that crossed my mind the moment the words left my mouth. I have a date tonight, hanging in the air of that vast, silent kitchen, like smoke that refuses to dissolve. I'd said it almost to myself, really. A casual thing. The kind of sentence you throw into the air when you're talking to a coworker, or your sister, or basically anyone other than the man currently standing 6 feet away from you, watching you with the kind of stillness that makes you forget how to breathe normally. Dong-yun hadn't moved. That was the thing about him that I'd never quite gotten used to in the 8 months I'd worked in this house. Other people, when they're surprised, show it. Their eyebrows shift, their shoulders react, something in them flickers. Dong-yun did none of that. He simply stopped. Like a clock that someone had reached inside and halted mid-tick. His hand, which had been loosely holding the edge of the marble island a second before, didn't tighten. His jaw didn't clench. He just looked at me with those dark eyes, steady and unreadable, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath along with me. I turned back to the vegetables I was cutting. Carrots, stupid carrots that suddenly required my complete and absolute concentration. "You said something," he spoke at last. Not a question. Dong-hyun never really asked questions. He stated things, named them, pulled them into the open with a calm that somehow felt more demanding than shouting ever could. "I was just thinking out loud," I said, keeping my voice even. "It's nothing. I'll make sure everything is set before I leave tonight. Dinner will be ready by 6. The dry cleaning is already sorted, and I called the Harper. Just my name. One word. But the way he said it made the knife in my hand slow down without my permission. I looked up. He was still in the same position, still wearing the same expression, which was to say almost no expression at all. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence around him. The 2 men stationed near the hallway entrance, his security, permanent fixtures in this house that I'd learned to simply accept the way you accept load-bearing walls, had both gone very, very still. "What time?" Dong-hyun said. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "What time is your date?" There was nothing threatening in his voice. There never was. That was the most unsettling part. The way danger always moved through him like water through stone, leaving no visible trace on the surface. 8 o'clock, I said, and then immediately wondered why I'd answered at all. He looked at me for another long moment, then straightened, adjusted the single button on his jacket with one precise motion, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. The room exhaled. I set the knife down because my hand had started doing something it had no business doing. Trembling, just slightly, just at the fingertips. I pressed my palm flat against the cool marble and told myself it was nothing. He was my employer, a famously private, famously controlled man who happened to run businesses that no one in this house ever discussed openly. He had his routines, his preferences, his rules. I had mine. In 8 months, those 2 worlds had remained professionally separate, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. I was the live-in housekeeper. He was Dong-hyun Kwon. The gap between those 2 facts was not something I spent time thinking about. Or at least, that's what I told myself on most days. Today felt different, though I couldn't have explained why in any way that would have made sense out loud. I finished the carrots, started on the onions, blamed the sting in my eyes entirely on the onions. The house was a 4-story property in the quieter part of Chicago's North Shore, the kind of neighborhood where old money lived behind iron gates and nobody asked too many questions. I'd come through a staffing agency, which had vetted me so thoroughly it had felt more like a government clearance than a job application. 3 references, a background check, 2 in-person interviews with people who were definitely not HR professionals, and then a brief meeting with Dong-hyun himself, which had lasted exactly 11 minutes and involved approximately 4 sentences from his side. "You will not discuss this household with anyone outside it. You will not enter the East Wing without prior notice. You will inform me of any irregular visitors or deliveries. You understand these terms?" I'd said yes, and he'd nodded, and that had been the entirety of my onboarding. What I hadn't expected, what the agency had not prepared me for, was the way the house itself felt around him. Not dangerous, exactly. More like pressurized, like the air was always slightly denser when he was in the building, and lighter when he was gone. The staff felt it. The security team operated in a specific frequency around him, alert, precise, never casual. Even the house seemed to behave differently. Doors were quieter. Phones never rang at the wrong moment. Nothing was ever out of place when Dongyun Kwon was home. I'd adapted. I was good at adapting. I'd grown up in a household with a mother who worked double shifts, and a younger brother who needed most of the steady things in the world to come from me. So I'd learned early how to read a room, how to stay useful, how to make myself functional in spaces that weren't always comfortable. This job paid almost 3 times what I'd made before. The room in the staff quarters was clean and private, and as long as I did my work well, Dongyun left me entirely alone, mostly. There were small things over the months. Things I cataloged but never analyzed too deeply. The way he'd once come into the kitchen at midnight, something he never did, and stood in the doorway watching me finish the inventory list, then simply said, "Go to sleep, Harper," before disappearing. The time a man at the grocery delivery had spoken to me in a way that wasn't quite right, and by the following week, that company's delivery route had been permanently rerouted to a different driver without explanation. The fact that my health insurance, which was technically part of the employment package, turned out to be extraordinarily comprehensive in ways the agency contract had not specified. I never mentioned these things. I wasn't sure I fully understood them. But tonight, with the ghost of his stillness still sitting in the kitchen with me, I thought about them more than I should have. By 5:30, dinner was done. The table was set for 1. Dongyun rarely had guests on weeknights, and I'd gone upstairs to change. My room was on the 3rd floor, separated from the main wing by a long hallway and a heavy door that I always appreciated for its soundproofing. I had a date with Marcus, who I'd met at my friend Diane's birthday 2 weekends ago. He was a high school history teacher. He was uncomplicated and warm and laughed easily, and I had decided I deserved something uncomplicated and warm in my personal life. I put on a dark burgundy dress, the one that wasn't too formal but wasn't casual either. Gold hoops, a little mascara. I looked at myself in the mirror and decided I looked like a woman who was fine. A woman who had everything reasonably under control. I came downstairs at 7:40. Dongyun was in the main foyer, not passing through, not on his way somewhere. Standing there, jacket still on, in a way that read less like coincidence and more like intention, though his expression, as always, gave nothing away. He had a phone in his hand, face down, and he looked up when he heard me on the stairs. His eyes moved over me once, just once, and then back to my face. The silence that followed was about 3 seconds long. It felt considerably longer. "Your dinner is plated," I said, steadying my voice. "I left the instructions for reheating on the counter if you're not coming back tonight." It wasn't a question, but something about the way he said it left a space where an answer was supposed to go. "I'll be back before midnight," I said carefully. "That's within the terms of my schedule." I checked. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. I genuinely didn't know what it was. He looked down at his phone, turned it once in his hand, looked back up. "Who is he?" The question landed so quietly that for a half-second I thought I'd imagined it. "Mr. Kwon. Who is he, Harper?" And there it was. Not loud, never loud, but underneath the calm, something dense and unmoving, like bedrock under soft ground. My heart did something complicated inside my chest, and I hated it for that. Hated the way my body kept responding to him, as though it hadn't gotten the professional boundary memo that my brain had issued months ago. "He's no one you know," I said, "and it's my night off." He held my gaze for a moment that stretched thin as wire. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. I walked past him toward the door, and the cold air of the foyer raised every hair on my arms even though the house was perfectly heated. I reached for the door handle, got it open. Behind me, just before the door closed, I heard him speak, low, almost to himself, Not really meant for me to catch. Be back by 11. I pulled the door shut without responding, but my hands were trembling again, and this time, I couldn't blame the onions. Marcus was the kind of man who arrived 5 minutes early. I noticed it the moment I stepped out of the rideshare and saw him already standing outside the restaurant, a mid-range Italian place on West Randolph that had good reviews and the kind of warm lighting that made everything feel slightly more romantic than it actually was. He was wearing a navy blazer over a simple shirt, and he smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile that reached his eyes without effort, open and unguarded. I smiled back, and something in my chest loosened just slightly. This is what normal looks like, I thought. This is what you wanted. You look amazing, he said, and the compliment landed simply, without weight or agenda. Thank you, I said. You too. We went inside. The hostess led us to a corner table, and Marcus pulled out my chair before I could reach it, which made me feel something small and uncomplicated and good. The restaurant was busy enough to have ambient sound but quiet enough to talk, and the bread basket arrived almost immediately, and for about 7 minutes I managed to be entirely present. 7 minutes. Then my phone buzzed. I turned it face down without looking. Marcus was telling me about a class trip he'd taken his students on last month. A Revolutionary War site in Pennsylvania. Something going wrong with the bus. Students singing off-key in a parking lot for 40 minutes, and he told the story well, with the kind of self-deprecating ease that made it easy to laugh. I laughed. I meant it. My phone buzzed again. You can check that, Marcus said, nodding toward it. Not bothered. Just practical. It's fine, I said. It's nothing. But I knew it wasn't nothing. I knew it the same way you know when a room has changed behind you before you turn around. Some animal part of the brain that operates below conscious thought, picking up frequencies you haven't named yet. I kept my phone face down through the appetizers. We were halfway through our entrees, pasta for me, risotto for him, when Marcus asked what I did for work. I gave him the version I always gave people in situations like this. Household management for a private family, live-in position, good pay, long hours. People usually nodded and moved on. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Private family like high profile? Private family like private, I said, and smiled to take the edge off. He laughed. Got it. NDA vibes. Something like that. What I didn't say, what I would never say, was that I'd spent the entire rideshare ride to the restaurant trying to figure out why my hands had been shaking. Why a grown woman with her own mind and her own night off was sitting in the back of a car replaying the way Donghyun Kwon had looked at her dress. One look, 3 seconds. The kind of look that shouldn't have registered at all. The kind that apparently registered in places I didn't have full administrative control over. I stabbed a piece of penny with perhaps more force than necessary. Everything okay? Marcus asked. Completely, I said. Tell me more about the Pennsylvania trip. At 9:15, I excused myself to the restroom. I stood at the sink, ran cold water over my wrists, an old trick my mother had taught me for when anxiety crept up uninvited, and looked at myself in the mirror. Burgundy dress, gold hoops, mascara still intact. A woman who looked like she had everything reasonably together. I picked up my phone. 4 messages, all from the same number, saved in my contacts simply as DK because I'd been too cautious, or too something, to write his actual name. The first. The heating in the east corridor is making a sound. Check the maintenance log when you return. I stared at that one for a long moment. The heating had never made a sound in 8 months. Not once. The second, sent 12 minutes later. The dry cleaning ticket for Thursday. Where did you put it? I knew exactly where it was. I had told him exactly where it was this morning, with a post-it note on his desk that I had personally placed at eye level. The third, 20 minutes after that. What is the name of the restaurant? I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the water on my wrists. The fourth message had no text. It was a screenshot. A screenshot of the restaurant's Google Maps listing, with the hours and address visible. Below it, Donghyun had typed, Parking on that street is monitored after 9. Tell your guest. Tell your guest. I sat with that for longer than I should have. Tell your guest. Not tell him. Not tell Marcus. Your guest, like Marcus, was a temporary variable in an equation that Dong-Yun had already solved without being asked to solve it. I put the phone back in my bag and returned to the table. Marcus was warm through dessert and warmer through the walk to the corner where we said goodbye. He hugged me first, which was easy, and then he asked if I'd want to do it again sometime, which was also easy. And I said yes, because I meant it. Or I wanted to mean it, which was close enough for a first date. He walked toward the parking garage. I called a rideshare. Standing on West Randolph at 10:43, the November wind doing something unkind to my hair, I scrolled back through the messages and reread them in order. The heating, the dry cleaning ticket, the restaurant name, the parking screenshot. 4 messages that, taken individually, could have been explained away as an employer with high standards and poor boundaries. Taken together, they added up to something I didn't have a clean word for. Something that sat in the chest like a stone, not quite heavy enough to hurt, but present enough that you're always aware of it. The rideshare arrived. I got in. By the time I walked through the front door of the house at 11:04, I had already decided I was going to say nothing. Walk in, hang up my coat, go upstairs, go to sleep. That was the plan. The foyer was dim, the way it always was after 10. Low lamp in the corner, the rest of the lights dialed down to their nighttime setting. I hung up my coat, slipped off my heels. Dong-Yun was in the sitting room. The door was half open, and I could see him from the hallway. Seated, jacket off, sleeves of his white shirt pushed to the forearms, the tattoos on his neck and chest more visible than they were during his formal hours. He had a glass of something amber-colored that looked untouched, and he was not looking at his phone or at any of the papers usually spread across that table. He was facing the window. He heard me stop in the hallway. I know he did, because his head turned slightly, not toward me, just slightly, the way someone adjusts when they register a presence without wanting to acknowledge that they'd been waiting for it. I should have walked upstairs. Instead, I pushed the sitting room door open the rest of the way. He looked at me then, full on, glass still in his hand, expression still composed, tattoos dark against the pale inside of his forearm. "It's 11:04, I said, keeping my voice steady. "You said 11. "I said 11, he agreed. "So I'm 4 minutes late." A pause. "By accident." "I know." Then, I stopped, reorganized. "Mr. Kwan, the messages you sent tonight." Nothing on his face moved. "The heating," I said. "The dry cleaning ticket I told you about this morning with a note on your desk. The restaurant." Still nothing. "Those weren't work things," I said. "Those were..." I searched for the right word and couldn't find one that was also safe. That was something else. He set the glass down on the table. One careful motion. He looked at me with that unbearable stillness and said, very quietly, "How was your evening?" Not "I'm sorry," not "you're right," not any of the things a person says when they've been caught doing something they know they shouldn't have done. Just, "How was your evening?" delivered like a stone dropped into still water, watching the ripples. The breath I took came out slightly ragged, which I resented. "It was fine," I said. "Good." "Dong-Yun." The name came out before I could stop it. Not Mr. Kwan, not a title, just his name, the way you say someone's name when you need them to actually hear you. He went very still, in a way that was different from his usual stillness. "What is it that you want from me?" The question landed between us. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that the lamp flickered once, long enough that I could hear the wind outside pressing against the windows, long enough that I became aware of my own heartbeat in a way that felt inconvenient and undeniable. "Go to sleep, Harper," he said finally. Same words as that night months ago. Same voice, but something in them had shifted. There was a weight underneath them now, something that hadn't been there before, or that I hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice. I left the sitting room. I went upstairs. I lay in bed for a long time with the ceiling above me and the dark around me, and I thought about the way he'd said my name back to me. Not out loud, but in that micro-adjustment of his stillness when I'd used his. The way a person moves when something lands closer than they expected. I did not call Marcus back that night. I told myself it was because it was too late. The next morning, I woke up 15 minutes before my alarm and lay there staring at the ceiling, which was something I almost never did. I was a practical person. I'd built my entire adult life around being practical, around knowing which problems were worth your energy and which ones you simply had to step over and keep moving. I'd learned that early, the way people who grow up with not quite enough of everything tend to learn things. Quickly, quietly, and without the luxury of dwelling. So lying in bed at 5:45 in the morning, replaying a conversation that had lasted less than 4 minutes, was not something I had patience for. Not in theory. In practice, I replayed it 3 more times before I got up. The house was quiet in that specific early morning way. Thick, almost solid. The kind of silence that exists before the world remembers it's supposed to be moving. I made coffee in the kitchen, stood at the window with my mug, and watched the backyard go from dark blue to pale gray while I tried to organize my thoughts into something manageable. The facts, as I understood them. Dong-Hyun Kwon was my employer. He ran operations I wasn't privy to and didn't ask about. He was controlled, private, and occupied a category of power that I had no real reference point for in my previous life. He had, over the course of 8 months, done several things that didn't fit neatly into the employer-employee framework I'd tried to maintain. Last night, he had tracked my whereabouts with the precision of someone who had resources and had chosen to use them. He had waited up. And when I'd confronted him, he had offered nothing. No explanation, no denial, no acknowledgement of the line he'd crossed. Just, how was your evening? And, go to sleep, Harper. I finished my coffee and started on breakfast. He came downstairs at 7:30, which was his usual time on Wednesdays. He was already in a full suit. Charcoal gray today, the kind that looked like it had been constructed specifically for his shoulders, and his expression carried the polished neutrality he wore like a second skin in daylight hours. 2 of his security team followed at a respectful distance, settling near the hallway as they always did. I set his coffee on the island without being asked, moved to the stove. "Good morning," I said. Professional. Even. "Morning," he replied. We existed in the kitchen simultaneously for approximately 2 minutes, which should have felt ordinary, and instead felt like standing on a surface that you're not entirely sure will hold your weight. I focused on the eggs. He drank his coffee. The security team breathed quietly near the door. Then, "I have a meeting downtown at 9. I'll be back by 4. "I'll have dinner ready by 6:30, I said. "Fine." That was it. He took his coffee, set the empty mug on the counter with that same precise care he gave to every object he touched, and left the kitchen. I heard the front door a few minutes later. The pressure in the room dropped by about 20%. I let out a breath I hadn't decided to hold. With Dong-Hyun gone, the house breathed differently. The security team thinned to 2, one on the exterior perimeter, one stationed near the front, and the staff who came in during the day, a rotating crew of 3 that handled specialized cleaning and maintenance, moved through the rooms with the relaxed efficiency of people whose nervous systems had been given permission to unclench. I worked through my list methodically. Linens on the upper floors, restocking the pantry, the call to the wine supplier about Thursday's delivery. Around 10, I found the post-it note I'd left on Dong-Hyun's desk yesterday morning, the one about the dry cleaning ticket location. Exactly where I'd placed it, untouched, directly at eye level, impossible to miss. I stood there looking at it for a moment. He'd known where it was. He'd sent that message anyway. I peeled the note off the desk, folded it once, and put it in my pocket. I wasn't sure what I intended to do with the information. File it somewhere, Let it settle into whatever category of things about this job I'd decided not to examine too closely. My phone rang at 11. Marcus. I stepped into the hallway near my room and answered. "Hey," he said. Easy voice, same warmth as the night before. "I had a really good time last night." "Me too," I said, and meant it in the partial, complicated way that it was true. "I was thinking Saturday, if you're free, there's a..." "Marcus." I stopped walking, leaned against the wall. "Can I be honest with you?" A small pause. "Yeah, of course. Last night was genuinely great. You're easy to be around, and I don't say that to a lot of people." I closed my eyes briefly. But I think I'm in a more complicated place right now than I realized when I said yes to dinner. And I don't want to waste your time if I'm not going to be fully present. Silence. Then, "Is this about your job?" The question was more perceptive than I'd expected. "It's about a lot of things," I said honestly. He took it well, better than he needed to. He said he understood, that the door was open if things shifted, that he hoped whatever complicated thing it was resolved itself in my favor. We hung up on good terms, and I stood in the hallway afterward with the phone in my hand, staring at the wall, feeling simultaneously relieved and deeply, inconveniently, unsettled. Because ending things with Marcus was not the same as knowing what I wanted instead. And what I wanted instead, the thing I'd been refusing to name, the thing that lived in the space between he waited up and go to sleep, Harper, was something I wasn't ready to hold in plain light yet. Donghyun returned at 3:40, 20 minutes early. I was in the main sitting room replacing the flowers in the large vase near the window. Weekly task. Grocery delivery had brought white peonies this time. When I heard the front door, I didn't turn around immediately. Kept my hands in the water, repositioning stems, buying myself a moment. His footsteps crossed the foyer, stopped at the sitting room doorway. "You're early," I said without turning. Meeting ended. A pause. "Those are different." White peonies. The usual supplier was out of the orchids. "They're fine." I finally turned. He was standing in the doorway with his jacket already over one arm. He always removed it the moment he was inside, a small and oddly personal habit I'd catalogued without meaning to. He was looking at the flowers, not at me, but there was something in the angle of his attention that suggested the flowers were not actually what he was thinking about. "I need to speak with you," I said. He looked at me then. "About last night," I added, because the silence had expanded in a direction that made me nervous, and I needed to steer it. He walked into the room. Not to the armchair, to the window, 3 feet from where I was standing, where he turned and leaned against the wall with his arms loose at his sides. It was the most physically casual I'd ever seen him, which somehow made it more, not less, intense. "You sent me 4 messages last night," I said, keeping my voice measured. "One of them was the address of the restaurant I was at. You found that on your own." No response. "I'm not angry," I said, which surprised me as I said it, because it was true. I need to understand what's happening here, because I have been professional in this house for 8 months. I have followed every rule. I have respected every boundary. I have done my job well, and I feel like something is changing that I don't have the full information about. And I don't..." My voice dipped slightly, just once, before I steadied it. "I don't do well with things I don't have the full information about." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light through the window cut across him at an angle, lighting one side of his face and leaving the other in shadow. "You canceled the second date," he said. The air left the room. I stared at him. "How do you..." But even as I started the question, I understood that the how was almost beside the point with him. He existed at the center of a web of information that moved toward him like water toward a drain. "That's not... I didn't cancel because of..." "I know why you canceled," he said. The certainty in his voice was maddening. The complete, unhurried certainty of someone who has already mapped the territory and is simply waiting for you to catch up. You don't know anything about why I... Harper. Quiet. Final. My name in his mouth again. That particular weight it seemed to carry lately, like a hand pressed flat against a door. I know. I opened my mouth. Closed it. The peonies sat in their vase between us, ridiculously white, ridiculously still. The afternoon pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly, and neither of us moved. This isn't... I started, then stopped, then tried again. Whatever you think is happening here, it can't happen. You understand that. I work for you. I live in your house. There are 100 reasons why this is... I know the reasons, he said. Then why? Because knowing the reasons doesn't change anything. He said it without drama, without emphasis, the way he said most things, as though the truth was simply a fact to be acknowledged rather than a position to be defended. For me, the last two words landed so quietly that I almost didn't catch them. For me. I stood there in the sitting room of his house, my hands still faintly damp from the flower water, my heart doing something entirely unmanageable inside my chest, and I looked at Dong-hyun Kwon, this man who had terrified half of Chicago simply by existing, who controlled rooms without moving, who had sent me restaurant screenshots at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. And I understood, with the specific clarity of something you've known for a long time, but refused to confirm, that I was in real trouble. Not the dangerous kind. The other kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already everywhere. 3 days passed without either of us mentioning it again. That was the thing about Dong-hyun. He never pressed. He'd said what he said, landed it with that quiet precision of his, and then simply continued existing in the house the way he always had. Breakfast at 7:30, meetings downtown, back by evening. The same controlled orbit, the same measured distance. Except now there was something different in the air between us that I couldn't unfeel no matter how many tasks I buried myself in. I repainted the pantry shelves. I reorganized the linen closet by thread count. I called 3 different vendors about a refrigerator filter that did not actually need replacing. Diane, my closest friend since college, texted on Thursday to ask how the date with Marcus had gone. Fine, I wrote back. We decided to keep it casual. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Then, Harper Renee Williams. You are going to explain that sentence to me in person. I sent back a laughing emoji and put my phone face down on the counter. Friday morning I came downstairs to find Dong-hyun already in the kitchen, which almost never happened. He was standing at the island with a mug in one hand and a document in the other, reading, still in the early hour version of himself. No jacket yet, shirt collar open, the full geography of his tattoos visible up the side of his neck. I had trained myself, over 8 months, to process this version of him as simply a visual fact of the household. Furniture, architecture. The training was failing. I moved to the stove with purpose. You don't have to cook, he said, not looking up from the document. It's my job, I said. You started early. You've been working extra hours all week. He turned a page. Take the morning. I turned to look at him. He was still reading, still holding the mug with casual ease, but the offer sat between us with a particular deliberateness that told me it hadn't been accidental. I don't mind working, I said. I know you don't. He finally looked up. That's why I'm telling you to stop. We held eye contact for a moment that lasted approximately 400 years. I'll make eggs, I said, and turned back to the stove. Something that might have been, in another man, a quiet laugh moved through the room behind me. Saturday changed things. It wasn't supposed to. Saturday was meant to be an ordinary day. Dong-hyun had no scheduled meetings. The house ran on its weekend rhythm, and I had planned to take my actual day off and visit Diane across town. I'd texted her. I had my bag ready. I was standing in the foyer at 11 in the morning, coat on, keys in hand, doing the thing where everything is fine. One of the security team, a broad, quiet man named Seo, who'd been with Dong-hyun for years and had said a total of maybe 40 words to me across all of them, appeared from the hallway. "Miss Harper." He said it with that careful formality they all used. "Mr. Kwon would like a word before you leave." I followed him to the study on the second floor, which was a room I entered rarely. Dong-hyun was at the desk, not seated, standing behind it, looking at something on his phone. He looked up when I came in. "There's an issue at the Meridian," he said. The Meridian was one of his properties downtown, a private event space technically. I knew of it the way I knew of several things in his life, peripherally, through the shape of its absence in conversation. "Okay," I said carefully. "The woman who manages the private dining was in a car accident this morning. She's not critical," he added immediately, which I noted. "But she can't work tonight. I have a dinner. 12 guests. The assistant there is 23 years old and has never run a service alone." I waited. "I need someone who knows how to manage a room," he said, "who is calm and competent and won't panic when things move fast." "You're asking me to work my day off," I said. "I'm asking you," he said, "if you're willing. It's not an order." The distinction landed clearly. In 8 months, he had never made that distinction before. Everything had been the natural expectation of a job, never a choice laid out in plain language. "I'm asking if you're willing." I turned it over, looking at its edges. "What time?" I said. "Be there by 5. Service starts at 7. I'll need to cancel my plans." "I know." "You'll compensate the extra hours at the rate in my contract." Something moved through his expression. Something that on another person I might have called amusement, but was too restrained to name with confidence. "Of course." I texted Diane a rain check and went upstairs to change. The Meridian occupied the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, and stepping into it was like stepping into a different definition of the word private. Not exclusive in the loud, performative way of places that wanted you to know they were exclusive. Quiet in the way of old authority, where the carpet absorbed sound, and the light was warm, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be because someone had made sure of it. The young assistant, whose name was Priya, met me near the service entrance with barely contained anxiety radiating from every pore. I spent 40 minutes with her going through the dinner setup, redistributing the tasks into a structure she could actually execute, and by the time the kitchen staff arrived for their shift, she had stopped looking like she was about to cry. "You've done events before," she said, somewhere during the 3rd hour. "A few," I said. "Keep moving. Standing still is when things go wrong." Dong-hyun arrived at 6:45 with his guests, 11 people, a mix of Korean and American, all of them carrying that particular quality of wealth and influence that shows itself not in clothing, but in the way they moved through space, as though it had always been arranged for them. His security team deployed with quiet efficiency around the perimeter of the room. He caught my eye once, crossing the threshold. Not long, not obvious. The smallest acknowledgement there and gone. I turned back to the service station and confirmed the first course timing with the kitchen. The dinner ran cleanly. There were 2 small crises, a wine order that came up wrong, and a guest with an allergy that hadn't been noted in the intake sheet. And I handled both in the space of minutes, without the guest registering anything had been wrong. Priya moved well once she found her footing. The kitchen team was professional. By 9:30, the main courses were cleared, and the room had settled into the looser, conversational energy of a dinner going well. I was near the service corridor reviewing the dessert timing when I heard a voice behind me that wasn't one I recognized. "You're not the usual manager." I turned. One of the guests, a man in his 50s, American, the kind of face that suggested he'd always been the most important person in most rooms he'd entered, was standing closer than the service corridor warranted. His eyes moved over me in a way that had nothing to do with my professional capacity. "The regular manager had an emergency," I said evenly. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" "Just making conversation." He didn't move back. "You've been running this whole thing. Along with our team, yes. Impressive." He said the word with a particular intonation that made it mean something adjacent to itself, but not quite the same. His eyes dropped briefly, came back up. Dong-hyun keeps good company, clearly. I kept my expression composed. I'll let the kitchen know you're ready for dessert. I turned to go. His hand touched my arm. Light, brief, but deliberate. I didn't catch your name. The corridor went very quiet. Not because of anything I did. Because of something that changed in the air about 3 seconds before I heard footsteps. Measured, unhurried, with the particular weight of someone who was never in a hurry because things arranged themselves around him. Dong-hyun appeared at the corridor entrance. He didn't look at the man. He looked at me, and in his expression was something I had never seen there before. Not quite anger, because anger was too imprecise a word for what lived behind his eyes in that moment. It was something colder and more deliberate, a decision being made. Then he looked at the guest. The man's hand left my arm. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The man said something in a lighter tone, something social and retreating, the conversational equivalent of backing slowly out of a room, and then excused himself and returned to the dining area. Dong-hyun stood in the corridor. I stood in the corridor. I was handling it, I said quietly. I know you were. His voice was perfectly level. I wasn't intervening for your sake. I blinked. Then for whose? His, he said simply. He needed to understand something before he made it worse. I looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen noise filtered softly through the door beside us. Somewhere in the dining room, someone laughed at something. You're going to explain that to me, I said. Eventually, he said. Dong-hyun? Dessert is ready. He nodded toward the kitchen door, a slight lift of his chin, practiced and composed. You were saying something about timing. I stared at him. He waited. I turned and pushed through the kitchen door, and the heat of the ovens rushed over me like something I hadn't known I needed. My hands were perfectly steady this time. My heart was not, but that was between me and the dessert cart. We left the Meridian at 11:15. Priya was closing with the kitchen team, and the guests had filtered out by 10:40. Dong-hyun walked ahead of me through the lobby, his security around him, his pace unhurried, and then held the elevator without being asked, standing with one hand on the door while I stepped in. We descended 14 floors in silence. In the car, his driver was already waiting. Dong-hyun opened the door himself, which his security team always did, and which he almost never did, and he stood holding it. I got in. He got in beside me, which was unusual. He typically sat in the front when it was just the two of us traveling from the house for errands. Tonight he sat in the back. Chicago moved past the windows in long amber streaks. You were good tonight, he said, not looking at me, looking at the city. It was a straightforward service once we restructured the workflow, I said. That's not what I mean. I looked at his profile. The city light moved across him in slow pulses. Gold, shadow, gold. I know what you mean, I said quietly. He turned his head then. We were close in the back of that car in a way that the geometry of the vehicle made unavoidable. The way proximity becomes something else entirely when the space is small enough and the night is long enough. Harper, he said. Just that. And in that one word was everything he hadn't said across all the days prior. The messages, the waiting up, the dry cleaning ticket he'd known perfectly well where to find, the way he'd appeared in that corridor without being loud about it, without being anything other than exactly what he was. I looked at him and felt the last of the professional distance I'd been maintaining dissolve around us like sugar in warm water. Slowly, completely, irreversibly. This changes things, I said. A warning meant equally for both of us. Yes, he said, straightforward. No qualifier, no hesitation. I need you to understand that I don't do things halfway. If something changes, it actually changes. I don't know how to do this otherwise. He held my gaze. Neither do I. The car turned onto the road that led back to the house, and the city fell behind us, and I made a decision in the dark with the amber light moving across his face that I understood, even as I made it, was the kind of decision you don't come back from cleanly. I reached over and covered his hand with mine. He turned his hand over, slowly, and held it. That was all. The city moved behind the glass. We didn't speak again until we were home. The thing about crossing a line is that you only understand its full weight once you're already on the other side of it. I woke up Sunday morning in my room. My own room. Nothing had happened beyond that held hand in the back of a car, but somehow that felt like more than most things I'd experienced in recent memory. And I lay there with the early light coming through the curtain and thought about what I'd done. Not with regret, exactly. More with the specific sobriety of someone examining a decision made in warmth now that the temperature had returned to normal. I had reached for his hand. He had held it, and when we'd arrived home and stepped out of the car and walked through the front door and the house had received us in its usual quiet way, we had simply said goodnight in the foyer. No drama, no conversation, no attempt to define or name what had just shifted, and gone to our respective floors. Like two people who understood that some things deserved more than a hallway. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table alone. I thought clearly, which I owed to myself. The complications were real, and I wasn't going to minimize them. I lived in his house. I was employed by him. The world he operated in. The one that moved through this house in the form of security teams and unmarked deliveries and conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, was a world I had no map for. I was Harper Williams from Cleveland, Ohio, raised by a practical woman who'd taught me to read fine print and trust my own 2 feet. I had no business developing feelings for a man whose business I would never fully know, and whose life operated on a frequency entirely removed from anything I'd grown up understanding as normal. All of that was true. Also true, the way he'd said for me in the sitting room on Wednesday. The screenshot of the restaurant. The heating that had never made a sound. The way he'd appeared in that corridor without raising his voice, without making a scene, and somehow made a grown man retreat with nothing but a look. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug, and decided that being practical didn't mean being dishonest about what was already real. He found me in the garden at 10. I was doing something that wasn't strictly on my task list. The back garden had a section of climbing roses along the far fence that had been neglected since late summer, and I'd been meaning to clear the dead growth for weeks. It was cold enough that I'd borrowed a pair of work gloves from the utility closet, and I was kneeling in the frost-stiff grass when I heard the back door open. He crossed the garden without hurrying, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, and stopped a few feet away. He looked at the roses, then at me. "That's not in your contract," he said. "I know," I said. I wanted to do it anyway. He crouched down beside me, which was not something I'd anticipated. He examined the rose canes with the same focused attention he gave to everything, then looked sideways at me with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded I had ever seen on his face. "I need to tell you something," he said. I sat back on my heels, waited. What I do, the parts of it you don't ask about. He paused. Not searching for words, I thought. More like arranging them with care. I'm not going to walk away from it. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist or tell you it's less than what it is. "I know that," I said. "You deserve to make a decision with accurate information." "Dong-yun," I looked at him directly. "I've lived in this house for 8 months. I'm not naive about what that means. I stopped being naive about it around month 2. A pause. I'm still here. Something in him settled. A tension I hadn't even fully registered until it released. "There are things I won't be able to explain," he said. "Not because I don't want to. Because some of it exists in spaces where telling you would put you in a position I'm not willing to put you in. I understand that. You might not always like it." "I don't always like a lot of things," I said. "That's different from not being able to live with them." He was quiet for a moment. The garden was still and cold around us. The Chicago November doing its usual thing. Gray sky, bare branches, the distant sound of a car somewhere on the street beyond the fence. "I don't know how to do this gently," he said. There was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not vulnerability, exactly, but the closest thing to it I'd ever get from him, I suspected. This isn't territory I've been in. Something about that undid me more than anything else could have. "You don't have to do it gently," I said quietly. "You just have to do it honestly." He looked at me for a long moment, kneeling in the frost-stiff garden of his own house, stripped of the suit jacket and the security perimeter and the impenetrable composure. And I watched something move across his face that I knew I was one of very few people who had ever been positioned to see. "Then honestly," he said, "I don't want you going on dates. I don't want you at 12 o'clock at night in a car with someone I don't know. I don't want you in rooms where men like the one last night think they can put their hands on you and it has no consequence." He held my gaze. "I want to be the one who has consequence." I let that settle. "That's a lot of wanting," I said. "Yes," he said, no apology. "And what do I get?" I asked. Not antagonistically, genuinely. "In this arrangement where you have consequence, what does that look like for me?" He thought about it. Really thought, not deflected. "Someone who makes sure you're not carrying things alone. Someone who..." He stopped. Tried again. "I notice everything about you, Harper. I have for a long time. That doesn't stop. It just becomes something you know about instead of something you don't." I absorbed that. The weight of being noticed. Fully. By someone with his quality of attention. It wasn't a small thing. It wasn't uncomplicated. But it was real in a way that very few things in my life had been recently. "I'm still your employee," I said carefully. "Technically." "That would need to change." I blinked. "I need this job, Dong-hyun. I need the income and I need..." "I'm not asking you to leave without a net," he said, with a patience that told me he'd already thought about this. "There's a property management position opening at 2 of my above-board companies. Real work, real salary, nothing that requires you to live in my house under an employment contract." A pause. "You'd have your own apartment, your own space. Nothing about your life would be contingent on whatever this is between us." I stared at him. "You've thought about this." "For longer than is reasonable," he said, and the dryness in it, the first real flicker of humor I'd ever heard from him, broke something open in my chest in the best possible way. I looked at the dead rose canes in my gloved hands. I looked at the gray sky. I looked at Dong-hyun Kwon, kneeling in the frost beside me with his coat collar turned up and his dark eyes steady on my face, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that the things worth having required it. "I want to meet with HR about the position before I agree to anything," I said. "A real meeting, real contract terms, not something arranged around what's happening between us." "Done," he said immediately. "And I need us to move at a pace that I'm actually comfortable with. Not rushed because you've been waiting. Not managed because you're used to managing everything." "Agreed. And if there are things going on in your world that start putting me in actual danger..." "They won't. Dong-hyun. I will not let them," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, total, with the full weight of someone whose promises were architecture rather than air, made me believe him not out of naivety, but out of evidence. 8 months of evidence. The rerouted delivery driver. The health insurance. The man in the corridor who had retreated with nothing but a look. I took off one glove and held out my hand. He looked at it. Then he took it, without the car's darkness to excuse it, in the plain gray light of a Sunday morning in November, bare hand and bare hand. "Okay," I said. He didn't smile, not quite. But the quality of his stillness changed in a way I was learning to read, a warmth in it that didn't show on his face so much as radiate from somewhere underneath. Okay, he said back. We stayed in the garden longer than made practical sense given the cold. Eventually, I finished clearing the rose canes and he stayed beside me without pretending he had anywhere more important to be. And that itself, the simple fact of it, a man whose schedule was maintained by multiple people choosing to kneel in frost beside a woman pruning dead growth from a garden wall, said more than most of what he'd articulated. The property management position turned out to be real. I met with the operations director of Quan Holdings' legitimate real estate arm the following Wednesday, a woman named Christine, who was sharp and no-nonsense, and clearly had no idea about the personal dimension of my referral, which was exactly how I'd wanted it. The salary was 30% above market. The apartment included in the relocation package was a one-bedroom in Lincoln Park, with south-facing windows and its own lease in my name. I signed the contract on a Friday. I moved my things out of the house on a Saturday, which was logistically simple since I'd never accumulated much. Dong-hyun was not home when I left. Not because he was avoiding it, but because I'd asked him not to be there for it. And he'd respected that without requiring an explanation. That alone told me more about who he was trying to be, with me, than 100 grand gestures would have. He texted when I'd been in the new apartment for about 2 hours. How is it? I stood at the south-facing window, with the afternoon light coming in clean and honest across the hardwood floor, and thought about the last 9 months of my life. The agency contract. The 11-minute meeting. The first time I'd heard him say my name in a kitchen that wasn't mine. The post-it note he'd already read. The restaurant screenshot. A hand turned over in a dark car. It has good light, I wrote back. His reply came fast, faster than his usual measured pace, which I noted and filed away warmly. I'll see it Friday. Not a question, but a different kind of certainty than what he usually carried. Lighter, somehow. Something that had come unstuck from the heavy architecture of who he was in every other room. I set my phone down and started unpacking. Outside, Chicago moved through its afternoon like a city that had no idea what had just quietly rearranged itself inside it. 2 people finding the specific, complicated, irrevocable shape of what they'd already been to each other for longer than either had been willing to say. No dramatic conclusion. No clean metaphor. Just a woman in her own apartment with good light, and a man who had already counted the days until Friday, and the particular piece of something that had finally been allowed to be exactly what it was. Honest, chosen, and entirely theirs.